Chess Association, summarising their online events, which are currently being held here in Canberra, Australia, while the ACT here is still in lockdown. And it's replacing the events that are normally held at our local chess clubs. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. And last night we ran our Thursday standard event. This is a long time control event, which means that it's only one round per week, played with a time limit of 40 minutes plus 15-second increment, and has a field of around about 25 players at the moment, although as with a lot of one-week events, people drop in and drop out. So I think we had 9 games last night, and after the smoke had cleared, there are now 5 players leading this tournament, all on 2.5 out of 3 as we reach the halfway point. Noting that some players, especially the older players, tend to take their time on this one. Really like this event because it's as close to the, I suppose, over-the-board experience that they're used to. But some other players, of course, junior players, not pointing the finger too much, tend to rush their moves still. But a lot of the games take about 2 hours to play, which I'm quite pleased to see. And I'm going to choose a game. It didn't take 2 hours. This is a relatively quick one, but it was between 2 adult players rather than our junior players. And as with most games, I try and choose games that have some instructive portions to it. And it was between Bibselton and Junathon, who are actually 2 local Canberra players. But I'm just using for the moment their online Lee chess handles. And off we go. So it was a modern perk defense, take your pick. In this case, bishop e3, c6. And c6 is a line I see a lot, and I saw it a lot in the over-the-board chess. And the idea is that at some point, black is going to try and play moves like b5 and b4 to drive the knight off c3 and allow black to threaten the pawn on e4. White played f4 here. There's a couple of other lines. h3 is considered not a bad move in this position, simply to stop the knight from going to g4 in some lines to threaten the bishop on e3. There is essentially a caveman line, which I play a lot, by the way. Worked with a certain degree of success against some opponents and not. And I'll just go right through this line. It's a very long line, but the ideas are very straightforward. And basically what white is going to do is put the bishop on h6. And the reason h4 gets played is because you want to follow up with h5. So after castles, you play bishop h6. Often in some games where I've played, after h4, my opponent has replied with h5 straight away. The drawback with that for black is then knight f3, knight g5 can get played, and it's very hard to shift the knight off g5. But we'll play the bishop h6 line here, b5, trying to counterattack on the queen side, and we get our h5 in. Knight takes is no good because there's just a rook takes knight line that tends to look like this. And pretty much that's the end of the game. So don't fall for that one. After b4 instead, knight drops back, and white can give away the pawn on e4. Queen to e3, bishop h6, queen takes h6, if I can get the queen, yep, like that. Sorry, computer playing up. Queen takes h6, g5, otherwise you open the h file and bad things happen. Knight g3 is one line, and then there's a very simple line with knight takes, and you take with the queen, and then you come back here, and material is even, if I can count. And there's a slightly trickier line recommended by the engine, which is bishop here, but I'm not going to go into that. Otherwise, all I will do is talk about these positions here. But anyway, the caveman plan of queen d2, h4, bishop h6 can be used with some success. However, I think the perk defense is a little bit more resilient, and if this worked every time, then no one would play it as black. So f4 got played instead, going for the big center. Queen b6 is an interesting response here. Knight f3, and if you give away the pawn like this, with queen takes b2, bishop goes to d2, retreats back to d2, and black can end up in a little bit of trouble here, even though white sacrificed a pawn. There is some very good responses available for white here, including pressure on the center. we're threatening just to take on d6, for example. C4 might get played as well to drive the knight to some horrible square. It's interesting that both sides at the moment have their king in the centre, which is not recommended when you should be trying to castle as early as possible. But white is slightly better off because white has more pieces threatening the black half of the board than the other way around. So, again, back from our divergence, back to bishop g7. So, h3, now to stop the knight from going to g4 or the bishop coming in. Knight f3 is also playable here. Queen a5, and we're pinning the knight on c3. And the tactic here is just to take the pawn on e4. And white decided to defend it with bishop to d3. If you're one of these players that likes moving your king around early in the game, king f2 actually can be played in this position. But again, I'm not sure how great it is, but it was a engine recommended move here. But bishop d3, now we get the b5 move coming, knight to f3, and black played bishop to b7, which turned out to be a bit of a nothing move in the end. It wasn't good or bad, but it didn't really help black's position. The other option is to do something like b4 and after knight e2, just castle your king to safety. You can play a move like b3, discover check, but it really doesn't do anything because after c3 and taking on a2, you're not really winning a pawn because b4 now just drives the queen away, queen back, and then we just take. And then the a7 pawn is a little bit weak for later in the game. So the bishop went to b7, castles and castles, both good moves, but I'm just going to stop here, just rewind it slightly. Okay, and we've got a position now where white certainly has completed all their development. Black hasn't. Black has got the knight on d7, which turns out to be a bit of a problem for black later on. And white has more space in the center because we've got these 3 pawns sitting here. And if you're completely happy that your center is nice and solid and your opponent can't really fight back, now is the time to start thinking about kingside attacks. Don't do it before you kind of get these positions is one piece of advice here. But once you get these positions, that's the sign to kick off, which white did. And white played e5 here, breaking in the center. And after something like d takes e5, f takes e5, knight d5, you can swap and swap. And white is not only plus here, but white has actually got an even more solid center, I think, because black lacks the required pawn breaks. Like can't play pawn to c5 to threaten the d4 pawn. And white can definitely start pushing now with a move like h4, h5 to try and open up the king side there. Instead, the knight went back in this direction, looking at obviously putting the e5 pawn under pressure. But after knight e4, pawn to c5 is the right move to try and break up the center, except there's a tactical problem with this move, which white decided not to play. I'm not sure whether white was fishing for bigger things or white just missed it, but the main line is you just take here, and then we just play knight takes d6. You're hitting the bishop on b7, and that's probably why the bishop going to b7 earlier on wasn't such a great idea. Bishop c6, we take on c5 here, and then after bishop takes b2, rook b1. White is actually very much winning this position. I'm not going to go too deeply into why, but I'm just going to say look at all the white pieces and how quickly they can get to the king side, and look at all the black pieces and look how long it will take them to defend the king side. So, pawn to c3 instead. c4 again. This is a tempting move that a lot of people play, but it's a bad move in that black no longer has pressure on the d-pawn. It's very much harder for black now to open the center, and it gives white a free hand to head over to the king side without having to worry about recapturing on the queen side or having the pawns captured on the queen side. And after d5, I think, I'm not sure, black was trying to close up this part of the board, but this really does help white, I think. White retreated to f2, okay, but I'm going to give you one of the rules that I think that is important over the years. It certainly worked for me, and that is knight eg5. And my rule is if you can play a move like knight eg5 in a game, you're almost certainly winning. And the reason I say that is because if you've got a knight on g5 and another knight on f3, hence you've got a choice of which knight goes to g5, you've probably got more pieces attacking on the king side than your opponent has got defending. And in a lot of games where I played against the modern and the Perk, and to an extent sometimes Sicilians, if I can play knight eg5, I'm very confident that bad things are about to happen to my opponent. So knight e5 here, for example, and you're actually threatening e6 in some lines. So e6 instead, and then you just play h4, and then h6. And here's now a really good example of how knight e5 does work. h5. You just sacrifice your knight on g5, because after h8, you bring the other knight in. And then if black continues with knight c6, you just almost get a completely winning position here. After taking on g6, bishop takes g6, and then there's really nothing stopping this queen from going to h5 and h7. Plus, you can take on e6 in some lines as well. And white has just got an absolutely winning attack here. But the knight went back to f2, which is not a bad move in and of itself. And pawn to e6, and then g4. Okay, and we're getting the right attacking idea now, b4. Now, having played g4, f5 really needs to be played for a couple of reasons. One, the move that white played gave black some defensive chances, which eventually they didn't quite take. But also, you may as well just keep going here. Remember, the center isn't a problem anymore. You've got more space on the king side. Your pawns are rolling. You may as well go with it. And I'm just going to give you a very long line which shows a nice checkmate eventually. So after e takes, g takes, b takes, b takes. By the way, when I go through a lot of the lines here, I know there are alternatives for black, but I actually like just to show how well it's going for white. As often, I'll just show the forcing lines where black actually just captures material, not in a suicidal way, but in a, hey, there's a pawn there, I can capture it for free. Bishop d2, it's the queen, drives it out of the way, and f6. Now, in this position here, black can try and hang on by sacking one of the pieces and aiming for a position where they get 3 pieces for the pawn, 3 pawns for the pieces, I should say, for the piece. But white will still be winning, because just mainly, again, because more pieces on the king side. If black doesn't want to sacrifice and retreats the bishop back to h8, then knight g4 is a nice move. You're just threatening mate on h6. Imagine you play h5, and now there's just a almost forced checkmate here. I think it's forced, actually, with knight check, king up, play the knight here, sacking the knight on h6, but then we play double check from the bishop and the knight on f7. King has to go back. Take the queen, take the pawn with the queen. It's not a sacrifice because the bishop on c2 is pinning. King has to go back. Queen takes, block with the bishop. Queen takes g7 mate. And there's a fairly direct mate, just again stemming from the fact that white has more pieces around the black king than black has defending. Instead, queen went to d2, and I think obviously f5 is the plan here, but just in a slightly different way. Knight c6, f5. Now, it was here that black had their last chance to save the game. If they'd played f6, it's actually not so clear. Again, I'll just walk down one line where there's some captures. Takes and takes. Hit the rook. And black sacrifices the exchange. Black plays rook takes f5, bishop takes f5, e takes f5. And although white is the exchange up in return for a pawn, so bishop and pawn, so rook for bishop and pawn, and nominally ahead, white's attacking chances have now disappeared. And in fact, black has completed the development of the minor pieces, and it's not so bad now in this position for black. Black can probably swing the rook to the e-file. The king's a lot safer than it was. Certainly white can look at trying to conquer some squares with things like bishop f4 and knight to e5, but black will play on for another day. And often, sometimes that's what you've just got to do. You're faced with a terrible position, give up some material, but block the position and try and dig in. Instead, black took on c3, and then took on f5, and now the position opens up for white. The 2 bishops are just going to really pile on here, as well as some other pieces as well. So g takes, rook f to e8, knight g4, again with the idea of playing something like f6, knight there, or in this case supporting bishop to h6 as well. And this position's almost completely done for now for black. Bishop retreats. We could play e6 here, and this position's just good for for white, sorry. Knight h4 is just the other move, and there's no dramas with this one either. Knight going to h4. Knight finally starts to come back to try and defend the position, but Bishop retreats to g5 is a nice move. Again, we can just take and play something like queen f4. But bishop retreats to g5, and the main reason the bishop came back to g5 is so that the h6 square is free for the knight. Knight a4 really doesn't help. White decided to eliminate that piece just in case there was some annoying tricks on c3. Takes, queen takes. Knight h6. If the king goes to g7, f takes g6 opens up enough lines, because the big threat here is rook f7 mate. Okay. And after knight h6, when the king went to f8, white took on g6 anyway, and black can hold off the checkmate for a bit with rook takes f7, but unfortunately just loses so much material while do so that the game essentially is over. And at this point, black thought it was very sensible to resign. Their comment after the game was that it was very much a one-sided game. I'm not 100% sure, but certainly there are a couple of key positions here. And the first key position really is this one here, where once you've got the nice solid centre, and in this case a lead in development, it was Steinitz that said, right, it's imperative you attack in these positions. Right, you have to attack here, and e5 is the right attacking move just to get the game rolling. There was a slight mischance here, where white should have continued with f5 to build up a winning position, and queen d2 gave the opponent a chance, as long as they followed the advice that an attack on the wing, in this case the king side, is met with an attack in the centre with f6 here. But looking through this game, I think this is a really good example here of how you convert an advantageous position. Not in a perfect way. We're not all perfect. And in fact, I was looking at some online Olympiad games last night between some very, very strong 2700 rated GMs, where eventually the difference between winning and drawing was just a single move, where one player might have just missed the one defensive try in the position. So it's not just 1600 rated players, it is 2600 rated players and 2700 rated players that this advice applies to as well. So thanks for tuning in. This was from last night's ACT Long Time Control Tournament. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. This event runs every Thursday evening for local players. We also have a Blitz tournament on Monday night. We have a Rapid tournament on Tuesday night. And we're also running a street chess event this Saturday, not in the street because we can't, but online as well, starting from 11 a.m. on Saturday. So thanks very much for tuning in, and I will see you possibly Sunday.